Hello and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. Today we focus on liberal values in academic institutions, specifically on this show, and on an institution which is counted amongst the best in the country, St. Stephen's College at Delhi University. We look at the future of this college and, in general, our universities. Many would ask, well, why should non-Stephanians care about what's happening in this college? I think perhaps this is a larger debate which reflects some of the fundamental fault lines, well, perhaps on debates on television and on the online world. Joining me today, a panel of eminent Stephanians. With me is, of course, Shankar Aiyar, also Swapan Dasgupta, Deepak Mukarji, Kalikesh Singh Deo. I'm also joined by Nivedith, Alva, and Dr. Guha. Thank you all very much for coming in. Like all good Stephanians and good Indians, I'm sure none of you will agree with each other, but that's what makes a good dialogue. Shankar Aiyar, liberal values in academic institutions. It may be seen as a topic no one cares about anymore, but I think perhaps the people around this table do. And when you see reports of what's going on at St. Stephen's College, do you worry that that perhaps may be eroding, or do you just see this as, well, look, it's a question of intra-college discipline, and why should we care?
I'm not in the least worried. St. Stephen's is not a liberal place because somebody decreed it that it be so. It just so happens that since some of the most outstanding school leavers in the country go to St. Stephen's, they tend naturally to be in the direction of liberal forms of thought. And I think 90% of the influence on students at St. Stephen's comes from fellow students, particularly those who are a year perhaps or 2 years senior to you, who constitute the role models or the people who are in a position to just help your mind to grow. I think teachers constitute about 4 or 5% of that influence. And I think good teachers constitute perhaps another 4%, which means that the principal barely counts. I think after the Reverend Allnut, who started the college, and then Mukherjee and Rudra, who really made a huge impact, since then the principals have been virtually irrelevant. Certainly, none of the principals that I can think of from Dagi Rajaram downwards, that's covering 50 years, has had a particular influence upon the college. The college is a great institution in spite of the principal, and therefore, since the current controversy seems to be around the principal, I think it's a hugely irrelevant discussion. So long as the boys there don't go off joining the BJP like occasional members from St. Stephen's do, the liberal traditions of the college will certainly be under no threat.
Liberal traditions of the college, as some BJP, some maybe on Twitter may call you a Sanghi Stephanian, which Shankar Aiyar says is a rarity, but let's see, that may be changing now as well. Is it perhaps a nostalgia for a St. Stephen's which never existed except in the minds of its alumni, perhaps, and we're not looking at a St. Stephen's needs to be reflective of what's happening in the current times. When you see much of what's coming out, the news of the colleges about this one has gone to court, that one has gone to court, does it disappoint you, or do you think the idea of St. Stephen's is actually largely irrelevant today?
Well, whether there is a single idea of St. Stephen's, as we tend to make an idea of India, idea of Shankar Aiyar, that's another thing altogether.
That's another separate dialogue.
That's a separate dialogue altogether. The point which Mani was making is that St. Stephen's had an open environment. He mistakenly calls it a liberal environment because it fits into some of his political proclivities. But there were various political proclivities, and the most important thing is that at every point in St. Stephen's, you were challenged.
Yeah.
And it was peer group pressure which either made you or devastated you. I know of various people who were completely devastated after their 3 years of experience in St. Stephen's and hated the place. But others came out loving it because I think it sharpened them. And being a liberal arts institution, primarily concerned with not what is in the curriculum. In fact, curriculum mattered very, very little to people.
I agree.
So there was that entire atmosphere, and that atmosphere had been reproducing itself over the years, over the decades. Whether there has been a sharp break in it, I'm not terribly sure. My son went to St. Stephen's and he graduated about a few years ago. And from what I could gauge from him, is that I think by and large, that tradition remains intact. Although, like many people who are fresh in college, who are in college, they often complain about sort of draconian regulations, etc. I would tend to say yes, probably in the earlier days there were less regulations than there are now. But that's a matter of detail and it doesn't really. I think St. Stephen's College is a rarity in India. It's a cherished rarity. I hope it remains that way. It's not going to be reproduced and you're not going to find many more of them recreated in other parts. Partly because those values which really defined St. Stephen's and made St. Stephen's what it is, are really diminishing in importance in the rest of the country. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is something we can debate. But the reality is, you were always a small minusculity. Now you're a beleaguered minusculity. I think that's what we can say.
Interesting on who defines values, but Deepak Mukarji, come in because you're in the governing body. So in a sense, you represent the college here as well. Looking at it beyond a sense of liberal values, who defines liberal values, but looking at it really as a clamping down, a change in the character or the value of an institution, which may be shrinking in relevance, but some would say is worth preserving. Why has that happened? Why is that clash happening with what seems to be very much at the core of what St. Stephen's is? Why is there an administration versus a value?
Well, let me explain this. I think Swapan mentioned this very correctly, that in the days gone by when we came out of school and we came to college, there was this sudden liberation of, or the sense of freedom that you had when you came into college. Because when you came from schools like I did from St. Columba's or like other people who came from Doon School, these were very hard disciplinarian societies where 6 of the best was not unheard of on a cold Monday morning if you hadn't done your homework. And after that you came to St. Stephen's College, where if you hadn't submitted your tutorial, you weren't caned, but you were certainly made to feel a bit of a worm if you hadn't done it, not by the teacher, who really couldn't care whether you came for the tutorial or not, because if you didn't have attendance in the tutorials, you weren't going up for the exams. But it was your peer group that made you feel a bit silly, that they had stepped ahead, you were left behind. Right. So it's all this concept of liberal thinking, as Mani said, is we were challenging one another as we went along. Today's world has become unaccepting of any kind of discipline that is required. The whole world has changed. St. Stephen's has tried to retain some norms of discipline, character building, of how do we take people forward together as a community and as a society. Pretty much like what any government tries to do is to create some sort of uniformity in thinking, or at least cohesion of thought. And that is where the rebellion part comes. And as you say, there is this idea of St. Stephen's that people have, which is ephemeral. It rests in their own head. It all has to do with the nibupanis and the cigarettes and the samosas that one had at the cafe or at the dhaba. It doesn't exist any longer. Cigarettes is not allowed in universities. Drinking is not allowed. It never was allowed in the university. If you did it, you were breaking the rules. Today, with higher levels of vigilance because of security reasons, you need to have enhanced security.
Reservations and various other laws that
well,
have
I wouldn't go into that. That, you know, is part of human evolution. But the point is, there are high levels of vigilance around, and therefore you are caught far easier than you were possibly 30, 40 years ago when I was in college.
Beyond the specifics as well, Kalikesh, if you can come in, younger generation perhaps than the others who spoke, but when we look at it, I said that, look, that idea or the nostalgia you have doesn't exist anymore. It's not really about, I think, just the cigarettes and the mince cutlets, etc., and which may seem very elitist. The fact is St. Stephen's now seen as an elite idea, an idea which is old-fashioned, an idea which perhaps a young graduate today who looks at where he can go to in life, St. Stephen's is not his first choice anymore?
Well, circumstances are changing. I think when I entered college in the early 90s, we found that there was an increase in the reservation. At that point in time, there was a change in the character of the institution itself. But by and large, the essence of St. Stephen's, the concept of being able to express yourself very freely, whether it's through drama or whether it's through debates or even a discussion around the dhaba and around the halls of the college existed. I think to me what's worrying me is that if that character in the institution changes, then that will be a problem. I think in today's day and age, we want our kids to challenge, whether be it governmental policies, be it social paradigms which exist. I think we want our kids to be able to express themselves freely. And if that changes, that's a problem. In terms of being elitist, I think that's more of a tag being given by people who either didn't get into college or wanted to get in and couldn't manage to for some reason. I think the fact is that the people from the alumni from Stephens have done very well in any field. I mean, there's Swapan, there's Mani, there are others who've done very, very well. And achievements and performance actually defines educational institutions. That's happened with St. Stephens. It's probably happened to other institutions also.
That's an interesting point, because it really, if you can't challenge whether it's government policy or whether it's challenging your principal or going online, that's the threat. Then Nivedith, Alva, if you can come in from joining me from Bangalore, if you can come in on the change in the character of the institution. There was a lot of controversy when reservation came in, that this again fundamentally challenges what St. Stephen's stands for, that in the mind of its alumni it was never just a Christian institution, it was an institution of liberal values. And when you straight away start defining issues like religion, one of the cases which the college is now fighting is, of course, that recent appointment of teachers, that 8 out of 10 in 1 month were all Christians who were appointed. Does that again, is that just part of a larger environment we now live in when everything is looked at through the prism of religion? Or is that a reality that has actually changed the fundamental nature of this college?
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say Stephens, like everyone who's spoken before me has said, Stephens was never just about the education. It was never just about, once you got in, there were 100 different things to do, which were always more important than everything else you did until it came to exam time in March and April. From the Shakespeare Society to the Debating Society to the History Society to the Planning Forum, there were lots of different fora for people to be able to express themselves, do stuff they liked, and build peer group relationships which last them throughout their lives. And now today, yes, freedom of expression and one of these debates which is raging about stuff like that is definitely important. But where I differ is, I am sure that college still, you still have spice things which people write overnight and put out all over college where they have a freedom of expression, cooler talk still comes out. But I differ where I believe that if a student has been given an interview by the principal and the principal wants to see the interview, I don't think the student or whatever that they're printing out can be done without the principal's permission, because at the end of the day, any institution you study in, there is a principal, right? And if he has asked for something, to do something against his explicit wishes or his explicit instructions, is going out of your way to do something which you've been asked not to do. So I don't think that in any way is infringement of your expression or of your rights as a student in college. On the other issue which you've talked about with regard to the hiring of teachers, from what I've understood, because I did some research yesterday, is that there's a 9-person committee which is put together for all hiring, out of which the principal is only 1 person. So yes, I think unneeded color is being given to the running of an institution. And what's most surprising is a lot of the articles which have been written on this badgering college, coming up with all these things about what all is wrong, are people who've not been studied in college. So where they're getting this information from, why they are writing this, and it definitely, from the tonality of it, I'm not trying to be snooty or oversmart, but it definitely sounds like a lot of people didn't get into college, and the last time they stepped in was when they were rejected at the interview.
Oh no, I said, Nivedith, I'm not entirely going to agree with that, because I think perhaps what Kalikesh you said will reinforce the whole snob Stephanian stereotype. So let me stay out of that. I don't think that's entirely true necessarily, so I don't agree with that. But let me get in Ram Guha. Sir, if you can come in, I said at the beginning of this program, it's not just about St. Stephen's.
It was surprising that a lot of the...
No, and I'll just go across to Ram Guha, because what I said at the beginning of the show was that it's not just about St. Stephen's College, perhaps, and that may seem as a very micro way of looking at it. It's really about a larger issue of the future of our academic institutions, liberal values. How do you liberate a college from being beyond looked at in a religious the religious ethos it's in, and perhaps look at what it teaches its students. What would your perspective be on this dialogue?
Well, I think liberalism is closely tied to pluralism. And I'm going to attack the elephant in the room which Nivedith wants to leave ignored, the Christianization of the college. And this well precedes the present principle. It's been going on for the last 25 years. At the St. Stephen's, in which Mani and Swapan and I studied, had an all India catchment. In the 1990s, there was a Supreme Court judgment which said minority or minority-aided institutions could go up to 50% in the allocation of seats. Could, not should. Unfortunately, the administration under Principal Wilson went against the advice of the best academic minds in Delhi University and said would. Now, if your catchment is all India, and suddenly you find that 2% of the population, which is what Christians are going to, give you 50% of the students, and in time 50% or 80% of the faculty, the character of the institution is going to change. And it has changed. That's the first thing. The second thing is related, but not directly connected. For several reasons, of which Christianization is one, St. Stephen's no longer enjoys the preeminence it did in the past. Many of the best students who want to do humanities don't go to St. Stephen's. They go to Lady Shriram, which has a much better department of politics and English. They go to Ramjas, which has a much better department of history. They go to Sriram College of Commerce, which has a much better department of economics. In fact, the only department, academic department in St. Stephen's, which is still recognized as top class, is philosophy. Likewise, people go to law schools. In my view, closely interacting with students from St. Stephen's and from the law schools, 20 or 30 years ago, the best students across India wanting to study humanities would go to St. Stephen's. Now they go to the National Law School in Bangalore. So for a variety of reasons, of which Christianization is one, but not the whole story,
yes,
the intellectual preeminence of students, whether it be of St. Stephen's, the intellectual preeminence of St. Stephen's, whether reflected in its student or in its faculty, is being challenged for various directions, and it's something which the college, its board, its alumni should introspect about. Institutions rise but also decay, and it's comforting to think that every critic of St. Stephen's is a person who did not get into St. Stephen's. But let me tell Kalikesh and Nivedith, I spent 5 years in St. Stephen's, and I'm appalled by the decline in St. Stephen's.
And the larger message, as I said, because really it's also about what happens when you see an institution in decline. Is it just about the college principal? Is it just about the governing body, or just, is there a larger impact you see? And really perhaps also, where do we look at creating new institutions of excellence rather than looking at creating more St. Stephen's or more SRCCs or more, say, Xavier's colleges? We just watch this decline happen in front of us.
Yeah, I think, Sonia, the decline of St. Stephen's is the cause of worry to its alumni, its current students, the parents. But it's not a cause of worry to India as a whole, because, as I said, the National Law School, the finest social scientists in India today, in their 20s and 30s, come from the National Law Schools. They don't come from St. Stephen's. The days of Shahid Amin, the great historian, somebody else, the great economist, Deepak Mukarji, the great economist, those are gone. The best economists and historians and sociologists are coming from the National Law Schools. You have to recognize this. Entrepreneurs are coming from the IITs, or they're coming from smaller towns, sometimes with, a Hindi language or a Kannada language background, which St. Stephen's mocks. So I think nostalgia for the past is misplaced. I think complacency is misplaced. A cold, hard look at St. Stephen's is required if it is even to recover a reasonable quality. As far as India is concerned, other institutions will step in. Now, there are new universities like Ashoka, which are completely modern, completely contemporary, 21st century, not believing in a disciplinary ethos of a 19th century British public school. So, I don't mourn for India, because other institutions will vacate the place that St. Stephen's once filled. But if St. Stephen's is concerned about its declining brand quality, it should not be complacent in the least.
Last question, Guha, because I know you're going, but last question, I use the word elite. Does it perhaps also imply, we've seen much larger democratization of all our institutions, a much larger, when you said catchment area, that you've seen this also with the Prime Minister, the pride in Hindi in St. Stephen's College, perhaps a Hindi-speaking student would have been looked down upon or mocked, as you pointed out. But in that sense, when you say it's an idea that belongs to the past, perhaps the word elite, which is now seen as a word of snobbery, is also an idea that belongs to the past, or in some sense intellectual is also seen as not a great compliment.
No, I think quality and elitism are two different things. Institutions should promote quality, not elitism. St. Stephen's in the past produced quality, perhaps also as well as elitism. The best students were middle class. I went to a very elite school, the Doon School, but my fellow Doskos who came in their Mercedes-Benz in chauffeur-driven cars, were treated with scorn, because they didn't contribute much to the college. So quality and elitism are two different things. And in St. Stephen's, however, there is this complacency. I think I don't want to remind my dear friend Mani about remarks he made about a fellow congressman who had went to Hansraj College. But that was St. Stephen's at its worst. St. Stephen's at his best is, Mani's a brave standing up for pluralism and secularism in public life, despite all the threats he and his family have received. But in elitism about English language or a certain, that doing an economics honors degree is better than doing BA pass. I'll give you an example. This is this huge story about economics honors degrees in college. Now, let me tell you that one of the 4 or 5 most successful Stephanians in India today is somebody who did BA pass and spoke Hindi, and that's Piyush Pandey, who did Narendra Modi's election campaign. And he would have been invoked in St. Stephen's because A, he spoke Hindi, and B, he did BA pass. So I think elitism and quality are 2 different things, and they need to be carefully distinguished.